There's a hollow in eastern Kentucky where the census takers stopped going after 1932, not because of distance, not because of hostility, but because the numbers stopped making sense. 3 men listed as heads of household. 1 woman listed as wife to all 3. And children, so many children whose birth certificates named fathers that couldn't possibly exist. When a state investigator finally made the journey in 1947, he found a compound where bloodlines had twisted back on themselves so many times the family tree looked more like a wreath. He burned his notes 2 days after leaving, but some stories refused to stay buried. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the winter of 1893, 3 brothers descended into a valley in Pike County, Kentucky, where the mountains pressed so close together that sunlight only reached the ground for 4 hours a day. Their names were Ezra, Caleb, and Machias Goins, 28, 26, and 23 years old, respectively. They came from Virginia, driven out by debts and whispers about their father's death. No one asked too many questions. Appalachia in the 1890s was a place where men could vanish into the laurel thicket and carve out kingdoms the government forgot to map. The brothers built a cabin where 2 creeks met. Not 3 separate cabins, one a long, low structure with a single door and windows that never had glass, only oiled paper that turned the inside light yellow and sick. They worked the same trap lines. They shared the same income. They ate at the same table. And when Ezra returned from a trip to Prestonburg in the spring of 1894 with a 15-year-old girl named Lucinda Whitaker, they shared her too. There was no ceremony, no preacher. Lucinda's father had sold her for $40 and a mule, a transaction recorded only in a family Bible that would later be thrown down a well. The brothers never clarified which one of them she belonged to. In letters that survived, neighbors referred to her only as the Goins woman, as if giving her a first name would force them to acknowledge what was happening in that cabin. She slept in a loft accessible only by ladder. The brothers slept below, taking turns in a rotation no one outside the cabin ever understood. By 1896, Lucinda had given birth to 3 children. The county birth registrar listed Ezra as the father of the first, Caleb as the father of the second, and Matthias as the father of the third. But people who saw those children said they all had the same strange flattened features, the same 2 wide-set eyes, the same way of staring without blinking, as if they were looking at something just behind your head. The local midwife, a woman named Opal Hensley, refused to attend any further births at the Goins cabin after that. When asked why, she would only say that the babies didn't come out right. But that was only the beginning of what the mountains would hide. By 1900, the Goins compound had expanded, not outward, but inward into itself, like a knot pulling tighter. The brothers had built 2 additional structures, crude lean-tos connected to the main cabin by covered walkways made from scrap lumber and tin. They never went to town together, never allowed outsiders past the creek bend. When the census taker arrived that year, Caleb met him at the property line with a shotgun and a prepared statement. 11 people living on the land. He provided names and approximate ages. He did not provide access. What the census taker didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered until decades later, was that Lucinda had given birth to 9 children by then, not the 6 Caleb reported. 3 had died before their first birthday, buried somewhere on the property in graves marked only with creek stones. Of the 6 living children, 4 were girls, and the brothers were already making plans. A traveling preacher named Silas Cordell kept a diary of his circuit through Pike County between 1900 and 1905. In an entry from October of 1902, he described being invited to the Goins property for supper, an unusual honor given their reputation for isolation. He wrote that the meal was tense and strange. The children didn't speak. Lucinda served the food but never sat down, and the brothers watched their oldest daughters, then aged 7 and 6, with what Codell described as an appetite that had nothing to do with hunger. He left before dark. He never returned. By 1910, those girls named Mercy and Temperance were 16 and 15. Neither had ever been to school. Neither had ever left the hollow. and in the spring of that year, both became pregnant. When a visiting doctor named Charles Brennan later examined county health records, he found something that made him physically ill. The girls had listed their uncles as the fathers of their children, not all three brothers. Just two, Caleb and Macy's. Ezra's name appeared nowhere, which meant either the girls were lying to protect him, or something even darker had been decided among the brothers themselves. The children born to Mercy and Temperance in 1911 were registered with the county, but the paperwork was incomplete. Names, but no fathers listed. Birth dates, but no attending physician. Just a note in the margin written in pencil by a clerk who'd heard rumors. Gone situation, do not investigate, per Sheriff Tackett. Someone in power had decided that whatever was happening in that hollow was better left alone. That it was a family matter, a mountain matter, something that outsiders wouldn't understand and shouldn't try to fix. And that's when the bloodline began to eat itself from the inside. 1920 brought the federal census. And with it, a young enumerator named Thomas Griffith, who'd never worked the mountain districts before. He ignored the warnings from the county clerk. He ignored the sheriff's suggestion to skip certain properties, and on a cold morning in January, he walked the 4 miles up the creek to the Goins compound with his ledger and his questions. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Griffith's official census report listed 14 people, but in a letter he wrote to his sister 3 weeks later, a letter discovered in an attic in Lexington in 1987, he described what he actually saw. 23 people, maybe more, living in structures that had multiplied like cancer cells across the hollow, children who couldn't tell him their ages, women who couldn't tell him their mothers' names, and a family tree that when he tried to diagram it, circled back on itself so many times he gave up and drew a series of loops instead. The 3 original brothers were still alive. Ezra, now 55, had gone partially blind. Caleb, 53, walked with a limp from a logging accident. Matisse, the youngest at 50, did most of the talking. He explained the situation with an eerie calmness that Griffith described as rehearsed. Like he'd been expecting questions for years. The brothers shared everything, Matisse said. The land, the income, the women, it was efficient, it was biblical, and it was nobody's business but theirs. Lucinda was still alive, 41 years old, and pregnant with her 17th child. But Griffith noted something disturbing. She never looked at the brothers, never looked at her own children. She moved through the compound like a ghost, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, performing tasks that seemed automatic. When Griffith asked her directly how many children she'd borne, she opened her mouth and no sound came out. Machias answered for her. 3rd in living, he said. The others were with God, but the truly horrifying part of Griffith's letter wasn't about Lucinda. It was about her daughters. Mercy and Temperance, now 26 and 25, each had 5 children. They lived in the same cabin and they shared the same husbands, their uncles, Caleb and Meshias. Ezra, Griffith noted, kept to himself in a separate structure with 2 of the younger girls, whose names Griffith couldn't extract from anyone. When he asked about the arrangement, about the legality, about the morality, Masha smiled and said something that Griffith underlined twice in his letter. The law stops where the creek bends always has. Griffith filed his official report with the numbers Matthews provided. He kept his real observations to himself, and when his supervisor asked why the Goins property took him 6 hours when it should have taken 1, he said the terrain was rough. But in the final line of his letter to his sister he wrote, "I think they've been doing this since the beginning, and I think the children born there now are the children of children of children. I think it's too late to stop." What he didn't know was that it was about to get worse. The 1920s brought roads to Pike County, not paved roads, just dirt tracks that logging trucks could navigate, connecting the deeper hollows to the towns. Progress, the politicians called it. But progress has a way of illuminating things that were better left in shadow. In 1924, a timber company surveying land adjacent to the Goins property sent a crew up the creek to mark boundary lines. 3 men went in. Only 2 came out immediately. The 3rd, a young surveyor named Richard Dalton, stayed missing for 6 hours before stumbling into camp after dark. His equipment abandoned, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold a pencil. Dalton never filed an official report, but he told the story once in a bar in Pikeville to a journalist who was passing through. He'd crossed onto Goins' land by accident. Following a property marker that had been moved, he'd found himself in a clearing where children were playing, if you could call it playing. 12, maybe 15 of them, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, but something was wrong with them. Not all of them, but enough. Heads slightly too large. Eyes that didn't track together, mouths that hung open, slack and wet, and the sounds they made weren't quite words, just approximations, echoes of language. An older girl, Dalton guessed 16 or 17, had approached him. She'd asked if he was there for marrying time. When he'd asked what that meant, she'd pointed to a cabin where 2 men were standing in the doorway. He recognized them from descriptions. Caleb and Meshes Goins. Now in their late 50s, they were watching the girls with an expression Dalton described as shopkeepers taking inventory. The girl told him that when girls reached bleeding age, the brothers decided which one would take them. Sometimes Kalb, sometimes Matthias, sometimes both, and sometimes her voice had dropped to a whisper here. Sometimes the sons did the choosing now. The sons? That's what made Dalton run, because he realized that the men he'd assumed or hired hands working in the timber stands weren't employees. They were the children. The first generation born in the hollow, now grown to adulthood. Men in their 20s and early 30s who'd never left the compound, never attended school, never existed in any official capacity beyond a name in a census ledger. And they were doing to their sisters and cousins exactly what had been done to their mothers. A local doctor named Everett Shaw became obsessed with the Goins situation after hearing Dalton's story. He convinced the county health department to conduct a welfare check in 1926, arguing that if even half of what people said was true, there were public health concerns that couldn't be ignored. The sheriff agreed reluctantly. But when Shaw and 2 deputies arrived at the compound in August of that year, they found it abandoned. Not recently. The cabins were still furnished. Food still in the cupboards, but deliberately, strategically, as if the entire clan had been warned and evacuated. Shaw walked through the empty structures with a growing sense of horror. He found beds, so many beds lined up in rows in the largest cabin. He found children's clothes in sizes that spanned infant to adolescent, all mixed together in piles. He found a ledger handwritten listing names and dates that he initially thought were births, but the columns were labeled differently. Breeding pairs, it said at the top, and beneath it, matches, brother to sister, uncle to niece, father to daughter, documented, planned, organized like livestock management. But the most disturbing thing Shaw found was in the smallest cabin, the one Ezra had occupied. A collection of photographs taken over decades. Tint-type images from the 1890s, faded prints from the 1900s, recent snapshots from the 20s, they showed the progression. The family at different stages, and in every photograph you could see it. The features slowly collapsing inward, the genetic load accumulating. The children in the earliest photos looked almost normal. The children in the latest photos looked like something else entirely. Shaw took the ledger and the photographs. He intended to present them to the state health board, but 3 days later his office was burglarized. Only those items were taken. Nothing else. And the sheriff quietly suggested that Shaw let the matter drop. Some things he said were family business, mountain business, and Shaw was an outsider who didn't understand how things worked in the hollows. But Shaw had made copies, and those copies would surface again decades later when someone finally asked the right questions. The Great Depression hit Appalachia like a second war, but in the Goins Hollow, almost nothing changed. They'd never participated in the cash economy, never relied on banks or jobs or the systems that were collapsing everywhere else. They were self-sufficient in the way that only truly isolated people can be cut off, not just from society, but from the need for society. And in that isolation, the experiment continued. Isranes died in 1931 at the age of 66. There was no funeral announcement, no obituary, just a note in the county death registry filed 3 months after the fact listing cause of death as natural. But a moonshiner named Curtis Blevins, who'd occasionally traded with the Goins clan, told a different story. He said Ezra had been sick for years, that toward the end he couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't control his own body, and that the family had kept him alive anyway, feeding him like an infant because he was the last link to the original plan. The architect, the one who decided back in 1894 that this was how it would be. With Ezra gone, Caleb and Mataz tightened their control. They were in their 60s now, but they'd trained successors, sons, and nephews. Though the distinction between the two had become meaningless, who enforced the rules. No one left the property without permission. No one spoke to outsiders. And marriages, if you could call them that, were arranged internally following a logic that only the brothers understood. A system designed to keep the bloodline pure, they said. But pure of what? By 1935, nearly every child born in the hollow showed signs of what doctors would later call genetic disorders. Cognitive impairment, physical deformities, seizures that started in infancy and never stopped. A traveling nurse named Dorothy Kindle encountered the family by accident in 1937. She'd been hired by the WPA to conduct health surveys in remote areas documenting conditions for a federal relief program. When she arrived at the compound, she was met by a man in his 40s who identified himself as Ezra Jr., Ezra's son by Lucinda, though he looked far older than his years. He told her they didn't need government help, didn't need medicine, didn't need interference, but Kindle was persistent. She'd seen poverty before. She thought she understood hardship. She didn't understand this. Kindle managed to examine 7 children before being ordered off the property. What she documented in her notes was clinical but damning. Microfill, cleft palates, club feet, developmental delays, so severe that children aged 10 functioned at the level of toddlers. And something else, something she couldn't quite articulate in medical terms. A flatness in their eyes, an absence, as if the light that makes humans human had been bred out of them over generations. She noted that several children had identical facial features, despite being told they came from different parents. She noted that the adults became hostile when she asked about fathers. And she noted in the margin of her report a question she never answered. How long has this been happening? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Kindle filed her report with the WPA. She recommended immediate intervention, medical care, possible removal of children from unsafe conditions. But 1937 was not a time when the government interfered with isolated mountain families. There were bigger problems. The Depression, the Dust Bowl, international tensions that would soon become war. A clan of inbred hillbillies in eastern Kentucky wasn't a priority. The report was filed and forgotten. But Lucinda wasn't forgotten because in 1938, at the age of 59, she walked out of the hollow for the first time in 44 years alone. Barefoot, wearing a dress that hung on her like a burial shroud. She made it 6 miles down the creek before collapsing on the porch of a Baptist church in a town called Freeburn. The preacher found her there at dawn, hypothermic and delirious. She died 3 hours later without regaining consciousness. The official cause of death was exposure, but the preacher, a man named Jacob Mullins, said she had marks on her wrists, old scars, the kind you get from being tied. No one from the Goins family came to claim her body. She was buried in the church cemetery in an unmarked grave. And when the sheriff went up to the compound to ask questions, he found the place deserted again. Not permanently? There were signs of recent habitation. But the family had vanished into the mountains the way they always did when outsiders got too close. And this time they stayed hidden for almost a decade, but the hollow itself remembered, and it was waiting. World War II pulled men out of the mountains by the thousands. Boys who'd never left their counties were suddenly shipped to Europe and the Pacific, exposed to a world that made their hollows seem like something from another century. But the Goins clan sent no one. When draft officers came looking in 1942, they found the compound occupied by women, children, and men who were either too old or too damaged to serve. Caleb was 75, Matthias was 72, and the sons, the first generation born in the hollow, had conditions that disqualified them. The draft officer noted in his report that 3 of the men he examined had severe mental deficiencies. Another had a spinal deformity that left him hunched and unable to stand straight. They were exempt. And the government, busy with a war, didn't look closer. But the war changed things anyway. It changed what was acceptable, what could be ignored. When the soldiers came home in 1945 and 1946, they brought new ideas about what America should be, about decency, about the kinds of darkness that needed to be dragged into the light. And in 1947, a veteran turned state investigator named Vincent Mara decided that the Goins situation had been swept under the rug long enough. Mara had seen things in Germany that convinced him evil wasn't just something that happened in faraway places under dictators. It could happen anywhere. In small places, in forgotten places. When he read through the accumulated reports, census records, health surveys, police notes spanning 50 years, he saw a pattern that made his stomach turn. This wasn't poverty. This wasn't ignorance. This was something deliberate, something that had been protected by people who should have stopped it. He made the trip to the Hollow in May of 1947 with 2 federal marshals and a photographer. They didn't ask permission. They didn't announce themselves. They simply walked up the creek at dawn and entered the compound before anyone could scatter. And what they found was worse than any of the reports had suggested. 37 people living in conditions that Mara described as medieval. The original cabins had deteriorated into leaning wrecks patched with tar paper and tin. New structures had been built, crude windowless sheds where children slept on floors covered with rags. There was no plumbing, no electricity, waste was dumped in a ravine behind the main cabin. And the people themselves, Mullah, struggled to describe them in his report without sounding hysterical. Multiple generations, he wrote, but you couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Women who looked 70 but claimed to be 40. Children who looked like old men. Adults with the cognitive function of infants. Caleb Goins was still alive, 80 years old, blind, barely able to speak, but still present, still the patriarch. Matthias had died 2 years earlier. No one could tell Mara exactly when or how, but their sons were in charge now. Men in their 50s with the last name Goins, who couldn't explain how they were related to each other because the relationships were too tangled. Brother and cousin and uncle all at once. And they were still doing it, still arranging pairings, still breeding the next generation. The photographer took over 200 pictures. Mara would later say he wished he hadn't allowed it. The images were too disturbing, too inhumane. Children with swollen heads and twisted limbs, adults with facial deformities so severe they barely looked human. And the eyes, every photograph showed the same thing in the eyes. Emptiness, not hostility, not fear, just a kind of hollow acceptance, as if this was the only world they'd ever known or could imagine. Mara tried to conduct interviews. He tried to establish identities, relationships, birth dates, but the answers were incoherent. People didn't know their own ages. Mothers couldn't name their children's fathers. And when he asked about Lucinda, about the woman who'd walked out of the Hollow 9 years earlier and died, an older woman started screaming. Just screaming without words until one of the men dragged her into a cabin and shut the door. Mara left the Hollow after 8 hours. He'd intended to return with social workers and medical personnel. He'd intended to document everything and build a case for intervention, but that night in his hotel room in Pikeville, he burned most of his notes. Not the official report that he filed, but his personal observations, the details that were too dark, too damning. He kept only the photographs and those he locked in a file that wouldn't be opened for 30 years. In his official recommendation, he wrote that the Goins family should be forcibly relocated and the children placed in state care. But the state attorney general read the report and made a different decision. The family had broken no laws that could be proven. Incest wasn't illegal in Kentucky if both parties were adults and consenting. And how do you prove lack of consent in a situation like this? The children were malnourished and neglected, yes, but removing them would require court proceedings, testimonies, evidence, and who would testify? The family wouldn't cooperate. The neighbors claimed ignorance and the cost, financial and political, of prosecuting something this sprawling and this grotesque was more than anyone wanted to bear. So the decision was made to do nothing. Again, to let the Hollow keep its secrets, to let the Goins clan fade away naturally through attrition and entropy. It was easier that way, cleaner. But some stains don't fade, they spread. Caleb Goins died in 1951 at the age of 84. With him went the last of the original three brothers who'd walked into that hollow 58 years earlier with a plan that should have died in the 1890s, but it didn't die. It metastasized. By the time the 1960s arrived, the compound had become something that defied classification. Not a family, not a community, something else. A closed genetic loop that had been running for 3 generations, producing human beings who existed in official records but nowhere else. The last comprehensive attempt to document the Goins family came in 1968, when a graduate student in anthropology named Rebecca Cordell chose them as the subject of her thesis. She'd heard rumors. She'd read Marat's sanitized report, and she convinced herself that with the right approach, empathy, patience, academic rigor, she could tell their story in a way that honored their humanity. She spent 6 weeks trying to gain access to the hollow. She was turned away every time. But Cordell was resourceful. She interviewed neighbors, some of whom were now willing to talk because the old codes of silence were dying with the older generation. She tracked down Dorothy Kindle, the WPA nurse who was in her 70s and still haunted by what she'd seen. She found Thomas Griffith's letter in his sister's estate papers, and she obtained copies of the photographs from Marat's file through a sympathetic clerk. What she pieced together was a genealogy that looked less like a family tree and more like a catastrophe map. She documented at least 4 generations of systematic inbreeding. She identified at least 63 individuals born in the hollow between 1895 and 1965, though she suspected the real number was higher. She calculated coefficient of inbreeding percentages that exceeded anything in medical literature outside of laboratory studies, and she concluded that by the 4th generation, the genetic load was so severe that most children born in the compound didn't survive past infancy. Those who did were so profoundly disabled that they required constant care. The experiment, if you could call it that, had reached its terminal point. The bloodline was collapsing under its own weight. Cordell's thesis was rejected by her committee, not because the research was flawed, but because it was too inflammatory, too sensational. One professor told her it read like Gothic horror, not anthropology. Another said that publishing it would be unethical, that it would expose living people to ridicule and harm. She was advised to choose a different topic. She refused, and she never completed her degree, but she kept her research. And in 1989, after decades of silence, she published it independently as a book titled The Hollow, 3 Brothers and the American Family They Destroyed. It sold poorly. Most libraries refused to carry it. But the few people who read it, journalists, true crime enthusiasts, genetic researchers, recognized it for what it was: documentation of one of the most extreme cases of multi-generational incest in American history. The Goins compound was finally abandoned sometime in the late 1970s, exactly when, no one can say. The last confirmed sighting of family members was in 1974 when a hunter reported seeing a group of women and children near the creek. By 1980, when a state forestry crew surveyed the area, the cabins were empty and already being reclaimed by the forest. No forwarding address, no death certificates for the remaining family members. They simply dissolved back into the mountains, leaving only the structures and the stories. Today, the hollow is overgrown. The cabins have collapsed into piles of rotting wood. The graves, and there are graves, dozens of them marked only with stones, are scattered through the laurel thicket. Occasionally, hikers stumble across the site. They post photos online of the ruins, asking if anyone knows the history, and people who know people from Pike County, people whose grandparents warned them never to go near that place, tell them to leave, to not dig, to let it stay buried. Because some things, once you unearth them, you can't forget. The Goins brothers built something in that hollow that should never have existed. A closed system, a genetic trap, a family that became its own prison. For 70 years, it ran on its own logic, its own rules, protected by distance and indifference, and the willingness of people in power to look away. And it produced generations of human beings who were never given a choice, who were born into a reality designed before they existed, who suffered for the decisions 3 men made in 893. We'll never know the full count. We'll never know all the names. Birth records were incomplete. Death records were never filed. The family kept their own ledgers, and those were lost or destroyed. But we know enough to understand what happened. We know that isolation plus control plus time creates darkness. We know that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it builds slowly, generation by generation, hidden in a place where no one thinks to look. The last confirmed descendant of the Goins brothers died in 2003. A woman in her 70s, living alone in a nursing home in West Virginia, who never spoke about where she came from. The staff only discovered the connection after her death when they found Rebecca Cordell's book in her belongings, with certain passages underlined, particularly one line near the end that Cordell had written after years of research. They were not born monsters. They were made into what they became one generation at a time by people who should have known better. The hollow is still there. The creek still runs. And if you go looking, if you ignore the warnings and hike far enough up the valley, you'll find the ruins, the collapsed cabins, the overgrown clearing, the stones that mark graves no one remembers. And you'll feel it, that weight, that sense that something happened here that stained the ground, that warped the air, that left an echo that won't fade no matter how many years pass. Some places remember, some bloodlines carry scars that don't heal. And some stories, no matter how deeply we bury them, claw their way back to the surface.